The autumn morning arrived swathed in grey, a thick mist, clinging to the ancient stones of Street Catherine's chapel like a shroud, as if the very heavens understood the tragedy about to unfold within those hallowed walls. The air held that peculiar dampness of October, neither warm nor cold, but something suspended between seasons, between hope and resignation, carrying with it the scent of turning leaves and extinguished dreams. Inside the chapel, candles flickered with uncertain light against the pervasive gloom, their flames trembling as though they too sensed the wrongness of what was unfolding. Lady Eleanor Hartwig stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, a creation that had taken 6 seamstresses 3 months to complete, each stitch a small prayer for happiness, each pearl button sewn with the tender assumption of a joyful future. The veil cascaded down her back in a waterfall of delicate tulle, and in her hands she clutched a bouquet of white roses, her mother's favorite, chosen to honor tradition and symbolize purity. She had stood there for 17 minutes, though it felt like 17 years, watching the chapel door with an expectation that grew more desperate with each passing moment. Behind her, the rustle of silk and the clearing of throats grew more pronounced, transforming from polite patience into something else, something that made her skin prickle with the first stirrings of alarm. The vicar shifted his weight from foot to foot, his prayer book held before him like a shield, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the door with increasing discomfort. She could hear the whispers beginning, soft as moth wings at first, then gaining strength and substance until they seemed to fill the very air around her. Where is Lord Pemberton? Surely he will arrive any moment. Perhaps the carriage has broken a wheel. How strange, how terribly, and terribly strange. Eleanor felt the truth settling over her slowly, like ice forming on a winter pond, starting at the edges and creeping inward until her entire chest felt frozen, her lungs struggling to draw breath through the crushing weight of realization. He was not coming. Thomas Pemberton, the man who had courted her for 18 months, who had recited poetry beneath her window and promised her the moon and stars, who had kissed her hand with such tender reverence and sworn before her father that he would cherish her all his days, he was not coming. The whispers grew louder, no longer concealed behind gloved hands, and she heard the word she would come to despise above all others: pity. Poor Lady Eleanor, poor, poor girl. How mortifying, how absolutely dreadful. She stood frozen, a statue carved from shame and disbelief, until finally her mother's hand touched her elbow, gentle and breaking, and whispered, "Come away, darling. Come away now." But Eleanor did not turn back up the aisle the way a bride should never walk alone and unmarried. Instead, she lifted her chin with a pride she did not feel, gathered her skirts with trembling hands, and walked forward down that endless strip of white silk runner, past the faces of 200 guests whose expressions ranged from shock to scandal to that terrible, soul-destroying pity. The veil remained in place, a merciful shield between her and their stares, though it could not protect her from the whispers that followed her like ghosts. She carried herself as though she were indeed a bride, as though somewhere ahead waited joy instead of ruin, walking toward nothing with all the grace she could summon, the white roses clutched so tightly in her hands that the thorns drew blood she would not notice until hours later, when the numbness finally gave way to pain. The weeks that followed became a blur of drawn curtains and unanswered correspondence, as Eleanor retreated into the shadowed rooms of Hartwig Manor like a wounded creature seeking the safety of its den. The ivory gown was packed away by her lady's maid, whose tears fell freely as she folded the silk that would never fulfill its purpose, and Eleanor watched with dry eyes, having discovered that some pain runs too deep for tears, settling instead into the bones like a winter chill that cannot be shaken. The invitations that had once arrived, daily requests for her presence at teas and soirees, at dinners and country gatherings, slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether, as if her humiliation were contagious, something that might spread to those who came too close. The few visitors she received came with carefully arranged expressions of sympathy that only deepened her mortification, their eyes sliding away from hers as they murmured platitudes about time healing all wounds and the Lord's mysterious plans, words that meant nothing and changed nothing. Her mother sat with her in the mornings, needlework in her lap, but her eyes constantly seeking Eleanor's face, searching for signs of recovery that did not come, while her father retreated to his study, unable to find words adequate to his fury at the man who had done this to his daughter. Her younger sister, Charlotte, would appear in her doorway at odd hours, bearing tea or books or simply her presence, understanding somehow that silence was more comfort than speech. It was Charlotte who finally told her the truth that the rest of the household had conspired to conceal. Lord Pemberton had fled to the continent 3 days before the wedding, accompanied by Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, a widow with whom he had been conducting an affair for the entirety of his courtship with Eleanor. The words landed like physical blows, each detail a fresh violence. He had kissed Eleanor while loving another, he had planned a future with her while intending to abandon her, had stood in her father's study and asked for her hand while his heart belonged elsewhere. The cruelty of it was staggering, the calculation required to maintain such a deception while looking into her trusting eyes. A letter arrived in the 3rd week, forwarded by Pemberton's solicitor with obvious distaste, and Eleanor opened it with hands that no longer trembled because she had moved beyond trembling into something colder and more permanent. His words were brief and brutally honest in their selfishness. He had realized he could not marry without love, had found that love elsewhere, believed she would eventually understand, and perhaps even thank him for his honesty. The audacity of it, that he framed his betrayal as a kindness, his abandonment as integrity, ignited something in her chest that might have been rage if she had possessed the energy for such a vital emotion. Instead, she walked to the fireplace in her father's study, held the letter to the flames until the fire caught, and watched the paper blacken and curl, his careful script disappearing into ash and smoke, taking with it the last remnants of the girl who had believed in poetry and promises, leaving behind someone harder, colder, and infinitely more alone. 4 years had passed since that grey October morning, 4 years in which Eleanor Hartwick had transformed herself from abandoned bride into something else entirely, not quite what she had been before, for that innocent girl was gone forever, but something harder and more deliberate, a woman constructed from will and necessity rather than hope and feeling. She had become a fixture of quiet respectability in the county, her days occupied with the practical management of her father's estate affairs, a role she had assumed gradually during those dark months of isolation, and which she now performed with a competence that surprised even herself. The account books that had once seemed impossibly complex now yielded their secrets to her patient attention, and she discovered in herself a talent for organization and efficiency that had lain dormant beneath the frivolous accomplishments expected of young ladies, the watercolors and pianoforte, the French and needlework that prepared one for drawing rooms, but not for life. She attended society functions with careful regularity, understanding that complete withdrawal would mark her as broken rather than merely wounded, but she maintained a distance that had become her signature, a polite reserve that discouraged intimacy while preserving propriety. The invitations had gradually returned, though they came now with a different quality, as if she were a charity case to be included out of obligation rather than desire, and she accepted them with the same cool grace with which she declined the occasional, half-hearted courtship attempts from widowers and younger sons who saw in her a respectable option unencumbered by excessive expectations. She had become known, and she knew it with bitter clarity, as the woman who was left at the altar, her identity frozen in that moment of public humiliation, as if nothing she did before or after could matter as much as that single day when she stood waiting for a man who never came. Her competence with estate management, her intelligence in matters of business and politics, her quiet acts of charity in the village, none of it signified as much as that defining abandonment, and she felt sometimes as though she were a character in a story whose plot had concluded prematurely, leaving her to wander through subsequent chapters as a ghost of narrative purpose. Yet beneath the careful armor she had constructed, beneath the cool efficiency and measured smiles, there remained something she tried desperately to ignore, a longing for connection that manifested in the quiet moments when her guard dropped, when she watched her sister Charlotte with her new husband and felt an ache she could not name, when she walked past Street, Catherine's chapel, and remembered not the humiliation, but the hope she had felt before it was destroyed. She told herself that safety was enough, that independence was a kind of victory, that she had transcended the need for romantic attachment. But in the deepest hours of night she knew these for the lies they were, understood that she had not transcended desire, but merely buried it beneath fear, and this internal conflict exhausted her more than any amount of ledgers or correspondence ever could. As autumn arrived once more, Bringing with it the traditional opening of the social season, Eleanor prepared herself for another round of polite endurance, arranging her face into its customary expression of pleasant neutrality, never imagining that this season would be different from all those that had preceded it, never suspecting that transformation was not always a thing one chose, but sometimes a thing that chose you, arriving uninvited and irresistible as the changing of leaves or the turning of tides. The country house gathering at Meadowbrook Estate was already in full swing when Eleanor arrived with her parents, the great hall filled with the familiar faces of county society and several notable figures from London, drawn by the reputation of Lady Pemberton's legendary autumn entertainments, a fact that struck Eleanor with bitter irony, as their hostess shared a surname with the man who had destroyed her, though no relation existed between them. She had perfected the art of entering such spaces with her armor fully in place, her expression pleasantly neutral, her posture conveying quiet confidence, while her eyes remained carefully averted from too direct contact, a strategy that allowed her to be present without being truly visible, to fulfill social obligations without risking genuine connection. It was during her retreat to the relative safety of the music room, seeking temporary respite from the ceaseless hum of conversation and laughter, that she first became aware of him, a tall figure standing near the windows, his profile severe and striking against the afternoon light, his attention focused on the gardens beyond rather than the gathering behind him, suggesting a man as eager to escape the performance of sociability as she was. Lady Eleanor Hartwick, her hostess's voice announced with unnecessary volume, having followed her supposed escape with a new guest in tow. May I present His Grace, the Duke of Thornwick? He recently returned from diplomatic service in Vienna. Eleanor turned with practiced courtesy, extending her hand and offering the appropriate words of greeting, while her mind catalogued details with the automatic assessment that had become second nature. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Thornwick, perhaps 35 years of age, known for his intellect and his reserve, being sought after by ambitious mothers, but apparently uninterested in the marriage market, his reputation suggesting a man more comfortable with treaties than with drawing-room conversation. His eyes were grey, she noticed, a clear, penetrating grey that seemed to look past surface appearances to something deeper, and when his gaze met hers, she felt an unexpected flutter of awareness that she immediately suppressed, recognizing it as dangerous, a betrayal of the careful distance she maintained. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice low and measured, absent the effusive charm that characterized so many men of his station, "Lady Pemberton mentioned you have been instrumental in managing the agricultural improvements at Hartwick Manor. I confess, I am more interested in discussing crop rotation than the weather, if you will forgive such unfashionable conversation." The surprise of it that he had sought her out, not as an object of curiosity or pity, but for her knowledge, that he had somehow learned of her work rather than her scandal, created a small crack in her armor, and she found herself responding with genuine engagement rather than polite deflection, their conversation turning to the challenges of modernizing estate management while preserving tenant welfare, to the new agricultural theories being debated in London, to the practical applications of scientific farming methods. He listened with focused attention, asked intelligent questions, offered insights from his own estates that suggested a man who involved himself in such matters rather than delegating them entirely to stewards, and Eleanor felt something she had not experienced in 4 years. Intellectual excitement, the pleasure of being understood as a thinking being rather than merely a decorative or tragic one. Their discussion lasted perhaps 20 minutes before duty and propriety demanded they return to the larger gathering, but as Eleanor moved away, she carried with her the memory of those grey eyes, watching her with something that looked remarkably like respect, and the unsettling awareness that something had shifted in her carefully controlled world, though she could not yet name what it was, or whether she welcomed or feared the change. The second encounter came 3 days later at Lord and Lady Ashworth's evening salon, one of those carefully orchestrated gatherings where political discourse was expected to mingle with cultural refinement, where the gentlemen discussed parliamentary matters over port, while the ladies were relegated to needlework and gossip. In an adjacent room, a division Eleanor had always found stifling, though she had learned to navigate it with the same careful neutrality she applied to all social situations. She had positioned herself near a window with a volume of poetry, creating the appearance of occupied contentment that discouraged conversation. When she became aware of his presence before she saw him, and some shift in the air or quality of attention that made her look up to find the Duke of Thornwick standing before her with an expression of what appeared to be genuine pleasure at the encounter. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying that same measured quality she remembered, "I wonder if I might impose upon your intelligence. There is a matter of some political complexity being debated rather passionately in the other room, and I find myself curious about a perspective uncolored by masculine posturing and parliamentary ambition." The unexpectedness of it, the implicit acknowledgement that women's exclusion from such discussions represented a loss of valuable insight rather than natural order, created that same dangerous crack in her armor, and she found herself setting aside the poetry and engaging with his question about the proposed reforms to the poor laws, their conversation quickly deepening beyond the political specifics to questions of moral philosophy and social responsibility. He listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving, building upon her observations rather than dismissing or condescending to them, and she discovered in him a mind that valued complexity over easy answers, nuance over dogma, a quality of intellectual honesty that she had rarely encountered in drawing-room discourse. They had moved on to discussing a recent philosophical treatise when she became aware of the whispers, that familiar sound that had haunted her for 4 years, and caught the words, "Poor Lady Eleanor's misfortune," from Lady Haversmith's direction, followed by speculative murmuring about the Duke's attention to someone of her unfortunate history. The old shame rose in her throat, hot and choking, the reminder that she would never be simply Eleanor, simply a woman with thoughts and capabilities, but always the abandoned bride, the object of pity and gossip, and she felt herself beginning to withdraw, to retreat behind her careful walls. But Nathaniel, she had begun to think of him as Nathaniel rather than the Duke, though she would never speak his Christian name aloud, turned with a deliberate smoothness that suggested he had heard every word, addressing Lady Haversmith with perfect courtesy to inquire about her son's recent appointment, redirecting the conversation with such skill that the gossip was diffused without direct confrontation, protecting Eleanor from further scrutiny while allowing her to retain her dignity. When he turned back to her, his grey eyes held something that looked remarkably like understanding, and he said quietly, "I wonder, Lady Eleanor, if you might enjoy a turn in the garden. I find the air in here has become rather stale." It was an escape offered with perfect plausibility, a kindness extended without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, and Eleanor found herself accepting with a hesitant nod, surprised to discover that she was being treated not as a tragedy to be pitied, but as a person to be valued, and terrified by how much that simple distinction made her want to hope again. The garden at Ashworth House had surrendered to autumn's gentle decay, the formal beds still maintaining their structure, but softened by the season's melancholy beauty, rose petals scattered across gravel paths like abandoned confetti, the air carrying that peculiar scent of fading greenery and approaching winter, and of endings that promised eventual renewal, though the promise seemed distant and uncertain in the amber light of late afternoon. Eleanor walked beside Nathaniel along the perimeter path, acutely aware of the proper distance maintained between them, of the way her skirts whispered against the stone edging, of how the lowering sun cast their shadows long and separate across the grass, two distinct forms that occasionally merged when the path narrowed but never quite touched in reality, only in that projected darkness that seemed somehow more honest than their careful physical separation. Their conversation had shifted from the political and philosophical to something more personal, though still carefully guarded, and she found herself listening as he spoke of the particular loneliness of his position, how duty and expectation created a kind of isolation that crowds could not penetrate, how one could be surrounded by people seeking favor or alliance and still feel fundamentally alone, understood by none, known by none, seen only as a title and a collection of responsibilities rather than as a man with thoughts and doubts and the same human longings that animated every heart. "I have spent much of my life," he said quietly, pausing to examine a late-blooming rose that had somehow survived the recent cold nights, its petals tinged with frost damage but still clinging to beauty. Performing a role that leaves little room for genuine connection, one learns to be cautious, to assume that interest is strategic rather than sincere, that friendship is often a disguised petition for influence. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that mirrored her own experience, though from a different direction. For she too had learned that people's interest in her was rarely about who she truly was, but about what she represented. Though in her case it was not power they sought, but the titillation of tragedy, the satisfaction of pitying someone whose misfortune made their own lives seem more fortunate, by comparison. "I understand something of that isolation," she heard herself say. The words emerging before her careful control could stop them, though perhaps from the opposite perspective, to be seen only as a moment of public humiliation rather than as a complete person, and to have one's entire identity reduced to a single terrible day. They had reached a small stone bench beneath an ancient oak, its branches nearly bare now, and by unspoken agreement they sat, maintaining that careful distance, but somehow closer in understanding than proximity alone could achieve. And in the silence that followed, Eleanor felt something she had not experienced in 4 years, the comfort of being understood without needing to explain, of recognition passing between two people who had learned to protect themselves but were tentatively, carefully, lowering their guards in the presence of someone who might comprehend what that protection cost. Nathaniel turned to look at her directly, those grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that should have felt intrusive, but instead felt like being truly seen. And he said, "It requires tremendous courage, I think, to continue appearing in society when society has proven itself cruel, easier, by far, to retreat entirely, yet you persist with grace and dignity that speaks of extraordinary strength." The words landed in a place Eleanor had not known was waiting for them, some deep internal space that had been braced for pity or admiration of the wrong kind. But here instead was something different. Respect for a quality she had never named in herself, acknowledgement of a choice she had not realized she was making every time she entered a drawing room or accepted an invitation, the simple courage of refusing to disappear despite how much easier disappearing might have been. As they rose to return to the house, the gathering dusk making continued absence from the party inadvisable, Eleanor realized she was smiling, and then, unexpectedly, wonderfully, terrifyingly, she was laughing at some small observation he made about their hostess's overly dramatic arrangements of autumn foliage, and the sound of her own genuine laughter startled her, for she could not remember the last time she had laughed without the sound being a performance of normalcy, a mask of ease covering the careful numbness beneath. Walking back through the garden with the lights of the house growing closer, Eleanor felt hope stirring against her will, dangerous and insistent as spring growth pushing through frozen ground. And with the hope came immediate terror, the visceral memory of what hoping had cost her before, the reminder that letting someone matter gave them the power to destroy, and that opening her carefully constructed armor even slightly might allow in not just light, but devastating pain. And she found herself simultaneously wanting to run toward this unexpected connection and to flee from it entirely, caught between the longing for something real and the fear that reality had already proven itself untrustworthy, that she was being foolish again, naive again, setting herself up for another humiliation that she might not survive twice. The weeks that followed the garden encounter at Ashworth House accumulated with a quiet inevitability that Eleanor found both thrilling and terrifying. As autumn deepened into the sharp clarity of approaching winter, and the Duke of Thornwick became an increasingly frequent presence in her carefully ordered life, his visits to Hartwick Manor, ostensibly concerned with matters of business with her father, questions about land management practices, inquiries about a particular breeding line of sheep that Lord Hartwick had developed, requests for introductions to the estate's remarkably efficient steward. But Eleanor was not so naive as to believe these consultations required the personal attention of a duke, nor that they necessitated the books he began leaving for her. Volumes of philosophy and poetry that appeared in the drawing room with her name inscribed on small cards in his precise, elegant hand, in selections that revealed he had been paying attention to their conversations with a care that made her chest tighten with equal parts warmth and fear. Her sister Charlotte noticed first, of course, appearing in Eleanor's chambers one evening, with eyes bright with suppressed excitement, to declare that the Duke had called 3 times in a single week, and surely Eleanor must see what that meant, must understand that a man of his position did not make such efforts without serious intent, and their mother began displaying that particular quality of cautious hope that Eleanor found almost unbearable, as though she feared that naming the possibility aloud might cause it to dissolve like morning mist, leaving only disappointment in its wake. Eleanor herself moved through these weeks in a state of hypervigilance, examining every gesture and word for signs of eventual betrayal, watching for the moment when Nathaniel's interest would wane or reveal itself as something other than what it appeared, some cruel game or, worse, genuine pity for the abandoned woman who had learned to manage estates because she had nothing else to occupy the hollow space where a marriage should have been. It was during one of his visits, when they had retreated to the library ostensibly to discuss a philosophical treatise on moral duty that he had lent her the previous week, and that the moment came, which would later seem inevitable, but felt in the instant like a small catastrophe. They had been debating a particularly complex argument about the relationship between individual conscience and social obligation, Eleanor gesturing to emphasize a point about the author's flawed logic, when their hands brushed across the open pages of the book, and the contact sent such a shock of awareness through her that she froze, every carefully constructed wall suddenly paper-thin, and she looked up to find him watching her, with an expression that held such unmistakable longing that she could not pretend to misunderstand, could not retreat behind polite oblivion. They both withdrew their hands quickly, the moment passing in less than a heartbeat, the conversation resuming with determined focus on philosophical abstractions. But something had shifted. Some acknowledgement had passed between them that could not be taken back, and as Eleanor watched him prepare to leave an hour later, noting the careful way he never pressed beyond what she offered, never demanded more time or attention than she was willing to give, she began to understand that his patience was not static, but rather evidence of a fundamental respect for her autonomy, for her right to guard herself, and this recognition was perhaps more dangerous than any passionate declaration could have been, for it suggested that Nathaniel Ashford was precisely the kind of man who might actually be worthy of trust, which made the prospect of trusting him absolutely terrifying. The Winstead Ball represented the culmination of the winter season, its ballroom glittering with enough candlelight to rival the stars that Eleanor could not see beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the air thick with the mingled scents of hothouse flowers and expensive perfumes, and the particular heated atmosphere that came from hundreds of bodies moving through prescribed social rituals, and she had agreed to attend, primarily because refusing would have seemed pointed, given that Nathaniel would be present, though now, standing near one of the refreshment tables with a glass of champagne, she had no intention of drinking. Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible miscalculation in subjecting herself to this particular form of public scrutiny. She had been aware of the whispers for weeks now, the way conversations seemed to pause when she entered a room, only to resume with increased energy once she passed, the knowing looks exchanged between matrons who had perfected the art of communicating volumes through the smallest gesture. But here, in the ballroom, the speculation had reached a crescendo she could no longer ignore, for she heard her name not loudly, but with that particular carrying quality that suggested the speakers wanted to be overheard, and the words that followed landed like physical blows, despite their familiar cruelty. "The Duke's attention to that poor woman seems quite marked, does it not?" Lady Ashworth's voice, syrupy with false concern, drifted from behind an arrangement of ferns that provided inadequate concealment for the little group gathered there. One must wonder at his motivations. Surely pity plays some role, for what else could interest a man of his standing in someone so marked by scandal? Another voice, younger, added with barely suppressed glee. Perhaps he conducts an affair and knows she is too desperate for respectability to refuse him, too grateful for any attention to demand honorable intentions. And the laughter that followed was soft but unmistakable, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability should they be confronted. Eleanor felt the words reopen wounds she had thought scarred over, the old humiliation flooding back with visceral intensity. She was standing at the altar again, aware of pitying eyes, aware of her own foolishness in hoping, aware that she would always be defined by that moment of public abandonment, no matter what she achieved or who she became. And the ballroom suddenly felt suffocating, the candlelight too bright, the press of bodies too close, the very air conspiring to remind her that she would never escape the weight of other people's judgments, never be seen as anything more than an object of pity or speculation. She set down her glass with hands that trembled only slightly, years of practiced composure serving her even now, and made her way toward the terrace doors with measured steps that betrayed none of her internal distress, smiling vaguely at acquaintances she passed, maintaining the performance of ease even as something in her chest threatened to crack open, and only when she reached the cold November air of the terrace did she allow herself to lean against the stone balustrade, fighting tears that would ruin her carefully applied cosmetics and provide more fodder for tomorrow's gossip, breathing deeply of air that smelled of dying leaves and approaching winter, and the promise of bleakness that matched her suddenly desolate internal landscape. She did not hear him approach, so lost was she in the effort to rebuild her composure, but then Nathaniel's voice came from beside her, quiet and concerned. "Eleanor, what has happened?" And she could not bring herself to look at him, and could not bear to see pity, or worse confirmation, that the whispers held truth in those grey eyes that had begun to mean too much to her despite every protection she had tried to maintain. "It is nothing," she managed, her voice not quite steady, merely the usual observations that follow women in my position. But he moved closer, not touching but present, solid, real, in a way that made her want simultaneously to lean into his strength and to flee from the danger of depending on it. "I perceive it is not nothing," he said carefully, and there was something in his tone, a barely controlled anger that was not directed at her, that made her finally turn to face him, finding his expression set in lines of cold fury that transformed his usually composed features into something almost frightening in its intensity. Though she understood instinctively that the anger was protective rather than threatening, directed outward rather than toward her. He held her gaze for a long moment before speaking again, his words deliberate and weighted with absolute conviction. "I have never acted from pity in my life, Lady Eleanor, and I do not intend to begin now. Whatever speculation occurs in that ballroom is the province of small minds seeking entertainment, and I will not allow their judgment to determine my actions or, I hope, yours." And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, the careful walls she had maintained, developing fissures through which dangerous hope began to seep, despite her best efforts to contain it, though fear still dominated, still whispered that hoping again would only lead to greater devastation than she had already survived. The information reached Nathaniel Ashford in the manner of most consequential revelations, not through deliberate seeking, but through the casual conversation of a well-meaning acquaintance who assumed he already possessed knowledge that would, in fact, alter the entire landscape of his understanding. He had been at his club, reviewing correspondence over a glass of port he had no particular interest in drinking, when Lord Weatherby settled into the adjacent chair with the comfortable familiarity of old friendship and remarked, almost as an aside, that it was remarkable to see Lady Eleanor Hartwick venturing into society again with such composure, considering the absolute devastation of that business with Pemberton 4 years ago, and when Nathaniel's carefully neutral expression betrayed nothing, Weatherby continued with the assumption of shared knowledge, describing in detail how the woman Nathaniel had been courting with such careful patience had been left waiting at the altar of St. Catherine's Chapel while her intended groom fled to the continent with his mistress, how she had stood there in her wedding gown as the minutes accumulated into undeniable absence, how she had finally walked down that aisle alone while guests whispered and pitied, and Nathaniel felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest, not pity, never pity, but rather a fury so intense he had to focus on keeping his hands steady around his glass, a protective rage directed at a man he had never met, but whose cruelty suddenly explained everything about Eleanor's careful walls, her hypervigilance, her fear of hoping, and more than that, revealed the extraordinary courage it required for her simply to exist in the society that had witnessed her humiliation, to attend balls and dinners and country house gatherings where she knew herself to be defined by that single devastating moment, to smile and converse and maintain composure while carrying the weight of public judgment and private pain. He excused himself from Weatherby's presence with some vague explanation his friend seemed to accept, returning to Thornwick House with his mind racing through every interaction he had shared with Eleanor, reinterpreting each hesitation and withdrawal through this new lens of understanding, seeing now that her wariness was not some general feminine caution, but rather a specific, earned knowledge that promises could be broken and hope could become the instrument of one's own destruction. And he sat in his study long into the night, staring at the fire and thinking of her standing at that altar, thinking of the humiliation and pain she had endured, thinking of the man who had inflicted such cruelty and feeling a cold fury that would have frightened him had he been capable of examining it objectively, but mostly thinking of Eleanor herself, of the strength it took to rebuild a life from such ruins, to risk even the small vulnerabilities she had offered him, despite knowing exactly how devastating betrayal could be. When he called at Hartwick Manor the following afternoon, he came with absolute resolve that his demeanor would not change, that she would see no pity in his expression or manner, that he would give her no reason to believe this knowledge had altered his regard in any way, except perhaps to deepen his respect for her resilience and his determination to prove himself worthy of her trust. And when Eleanor received him in the drawing-room, he watched her face carefully, saw the guarded assessment in her eyes as she tried to determine whether he had heard, whether he now knew her shame, and he responded by treating her exactly as he always had, with respect and careful attention, and the kind of regard that recognized her as a complete person rather than a tragedy to be pitied. He had not planned to invite her to accompany him on his visit to the Thornwick tenants who had recently welcomed their fourth child, but in the moment it seemed the perfect demonstration that his knowledge changed nothing of substance between them, and when he extended the invitation, treating her as a partner whose opinion and presence he valued rather than a fragile creature requiring protection, he saw something shift in her expression, a tentative easing of tension, and during the hours they spent visiting the tenant family, discussing matters of estate management and appropriate support for growing families, the naturalness of their partnership became evident in ways that transcended words, their complementary strengths, the way they seemed to anticipate each other's thoughts, the easy collaboration that suggested not pity or charity, but genuine compatibility. And as they returned to Hartwick Manor in the late afternoon light, Nathaniel understood that his resolve had crystallized into something unshakable. He would court Eleanor Hartwick with such consistency and patience that she would come to understand that not all men were Pemberton, that some promises were kept, that trust, though terrifying, could sometimes be deserved. Winter had arrived with its stark beauty, the landscape transformed into something both austere and magnificent, bare trees, etching black lines against skies that held the peculiar brightness of coming snow, the gardens at Hartwick Manor stripped to their essential architecture, revealing bones that summer's abundance had concealed, and Nathaniel had called on Eleanor with such regularity over the preceding months that her family no longer remarked upon his visits, though her mother's hopeful glances and her sister's barely suppressed excitement suggested they understood the significance of his consistent presence, even if no formal understanding had been announced. And on this particular afternoon, Eleanor had received him in the library where they had spent so many hours in comfortable conversation, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the winter light filtering through the windows with that quality of illumination that seemed both cold and crystalline, and they had been discussing some matter of estate management, the comfortable discourse of shared interests and complementary perspectives, when Nathaniel's demeanor shifted in a way Eleanor perceived immediately, a subtle change in his posture and expression that signaled the conversation was moving into territory more personal and infinitely more dangerous. He had set down his teacup with deliberate care, his grey eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch even before he began to speak, and when the words came they were measured and careful, chosen with the precision she had come to recognize as characteristic of his approach to all consequential matters. Lady Eleanor, I hope you know that my regard for you has grown over these months into something I can no longer contain within the boundaries of friendship. I have come to understand that what I feel is admiration, certainly, but more than that, affection of the deepest kind, and I find myself unable to imagine a future that does not include your presence, your partnership, and your companionship in all the years to come. He continued speaking, his proposal unfolding with careful logic that emphasized partnership and mutual respect, speaking of their shared interests and compatible temperaments, of his desire for a union built on intellectual equality and genuine regard rather than mere social convenience. And Eleanor heard the words as though from a great distance, her mind suddenly unable to process their meaning, even as her body responded with visceral terror. Her hands began to tremble, her chest constricting with the familiar sensation of panic, the room seeming to tilt and spin as memory overwhelmed present reality. And she was standing at the altar again, dressed in white satin and Brussels lace, waiting for a man who would never come, aware of whispers and pitying glances, aware of her own foolishness in believing promises that proved worthless, and the shame and humiliation of that day crashed over her with such force that she could not speak, could not breathe, could not do anything but sit frozen, while Nathaniel's carefully constructed proposal hung in the air between them like something beautiful and terrible and absolutely impossible to accept. She saw his expression shift from hopeful expectation to immediate concern, his instinctive movement toward her checked by some intuitive understanding that proximity might worsen rather than ease her distress, and he said something, words she could not quite process through the roaring in her ears, his voice gentle and careful, giving her space, offering release from the expectation of immediate response, and Eleanor found herself standing, though she had no memory of rising, found herself moving toward the door with jerky, uncoordinated movements that betrayed the complete dissolution of her usually impeccable composure, and Nathaniel made no move to stop her, simply stood watching with an expression of such concerned gentleness that it somehow made everything worse, made the terror more acute, because she wanted desperately to say yes, even as every instinct screamed that hoping again would lead only to greater devastation than she had already survived. And she fled the library without speaking, leaving him standing alone beside the fire, while her mind waged war against her heart, desire battling terror in a conflict that left her breathless and shaking as she reached her room and closed the door against the world and the dangerous, beautiful, absolutely impossible future he had offered her. Eleanor reached her room and closed the door with trembling hands, leaning against the solid wood, as though it might hold back, not just the world, but the torrent of emotion, threatening to overwhelm her entirely, and through the window she could see snow beginning to fall in thick, silent flakes that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and strange, covering the gardens and pathways with white that seemed both pure and suffocating. And she moved to the window seat with unsteady steps, pressing her forehead against the cold glass, while her mind replayed Nathaniel's proposal in endless, torturous repetition, his careful words, his sincere expression, the hope she had seen in his grey eyes, before her panic had driven her from the room, and beneath his voice she heard the echo of other promises, felt the ghost of that day 4 years ago when she had stood in white satin and believed herself beloved, when she had waited at the altar with her heart full of naive hope, while minutes accumulated into certainty that she had been abandoned, left standing before God and society as a monument to misplaced trust and foolish faith. And the terror that gripped her now was not rational or reasoned, but rather visceral and complete, the bone-deep certainty that hoping again would lead only to greater devastation, because this time she would know better, this time she could not claim the excuse of innocence, and if Nathaniel proved false, if he left her as Pemberton had left her, she would have only herself to blame for being stupid enough to believe that promises meant anything, that affection could be trusted, that a man's regard might actually prove constant rather than convenient. She could imagine it with terrible clarity, standing at St. Catherine's Chapel again, dressed in another wedding gown, watching the minutes pass while guests whispered with renewed pity, hearing them say that poor Lady Eleanor should have known better, that clearly there was something wrong with her if 2 men found her unworthy of keeping their promises, and the humiliation would be unbearable this time, because it would be compounded by her own culpability in hoping, in trusting, in allowing herself to believe that she might deserve happiness. And yet even as these thoughts spiraled through her mind with increasingly frantic intensity, another voice whispered beneath them, quieter but persistent, reminding her of the past months, of Nathaniel's unfailing consistency, of the way he appeared exactly when promised and treated her with respect rather than pity, of how their partnership felt natural and right in ways that her engagement to Pemberton never had, even when she was too naive to recognize the difference, of the intellectual companionship and comfortable silences that suggested compatibility deeper than mere social convenience, and she did not know which voice to believe, which truth to trust, and the conflict left her breathless and shaking as the snow continued to fall beyond the window, accumulating in drifts that would make the roads impassable and that would trap her in this moment of indecision as surely as her fear trapped her between desire and terror. A soft knock at her door eventually penetrated her awareness, and her sister Catherine entered without waiting for invitation, taking one look at Eleanor's face and immediately crossing the room to sit beside her on the window seat, taking her cold hands in warm ones and simply waiting with the patience that had always characterized her gentle nature, and after a long silence Eleanor found herself speaking, the words tumbling out in disjointed confession. "He proposed, and I fled like a coward. And I want desperately to say yes, but Catherine, what if he leaves? What if I stand at that altar again and he does not come? What if everyone sees me humiliated twice over and knows me for the fool I am?" And Catherine listened without interruption until the words ran dry, then spoke with quiet wisdom that belied her younger years, reminding Eleanor that refusing Nathaniel was not safety but merely a different kind of loss, that she could protect herself from potential heartbreak only by guaranteeing present loneliness, that Pemberton's cruelty had already stolen 4 years of her life, and refusing to risk again would let him steal all the years that remained, and most importantly, that love always required courage, because the alternative to risking pain was accepting numbness. And which death did Eleanor prefer, the death of hoping and possibly losing, or the death of never hoping at all? And Eleanor realized with sudden, crystalline clarity that her sister was right, that refusing Nathaniel would indeed be letting Pemberton win, would be allowing fear to rule her life completely, would be choosing safety over living, and while the terror remained, would perhaps always remain. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but rather the decision to act despite it. And sitting there watching snow transform the world beyond her window, she began to imagine something different from the disaster her fear predicted, began to tentatively allow herself to remember Nathaniel's steady presence and wonder whether perhaps this time, this man, might actually prove constant, might actually mean the promises he made, might actually be offering not a repetition of past pain, but the possibility of future joy. Eleanor sent word to Nathaniel the following morning, a brief, formal note, requesting that he call upon her at 2 o'clock if his schedule permitted, and she spent the intervening hours in a state of trembling determination, rehearsing what she needed to say while watching through her window as the world beyond transformed under clear skies. The snow that had fallen during her dark night of the soul, now glittering in brilliant sunshine that made everything appear both pristine and possible, as though nature itself offered evidence that storms could pass and leave beauty in their wake. And when Nathaniel arrived precisely at the appointed hour, she received him again in the library where his proposal had sent her fleeing in panic. But this time she had fortified herself with the courage her sister had helped her recognize, the understanding that speaking her truth, all of it, the shameful and painful parts she had kept hidden, was necessary if there was to be any possibility of the future he offered. And so when he entered with careful courtesy, his grey eyes searching her face with concern and question, she gestured for him to sit and remained standing herself, because movement seemed necessary to force the words past the constriction in her throat, and she began to speak with hands that trembled, despite her best efforts at composure, telling him first about that day 4 years ago, in halting sentences that gradually gained momentum as the story poured from her, how she had stood at St. Catherine's Chapel in white satin and Brussels lace, how the minutes had accumulated while guests whispered and shifted uncomfortably, how she had felt the exact moment when waiting became certainty that Lord Pemberton would not come, how she had walked down the aisle alone past pitying faces while humiliation burned through her like fire, and then the aftermath, the weeks of isolation and the social ruin, the way invitations ceased and supposed friends spoke of her in tones of condescending sympathy, and finally Pemberton's letter explaining his long-standing affair with another woman and his casual cruelty in admitting he had never truly intended to marry Eleanor, but had found himself trapped by circumstance and family expectation until flight seemed his only option. And she told Nathaniel how she had burned that letter and watched her naive dreams turn to ash, but could not burn the memory, could not erase the fundamental lesson she had learned about the worthlessness of promises and the foolishness of trust. And her voice broke as she described the fear that now gripped her, the terror of standing at an altar again, of hoping again, of risking the devastating humiliation of being abandoned twice over, because what would that say about her? What essential flaw must she possess if 2 men found her unworthy of keeping their promises? And she explained that she wanted desperately to say yes to his proposal, but did not know how to silence the voice that insisted hoping was simply inviting greater pain, that trusting again would prove her not brave but merely stupid. And when she finally fell silent, the words exhausted and her composure hanging by the thinnest thread, she looked at Nathaniel where he sat, watching her with an expression of such focused attention that she knew he had heard not just her words, but the fear beneath them. And the silence that followed felt heavy with emotion, weighted with all she had revealed and all that now hung in the balance. And she waited for his response, with her heart pounding and her hands still trembling, uncertain whether confession would bring relief, or simply confirm that she was too damaged for the happiness he offered, but knowing that honesty was the only foundation upon which anything real might be built. And so she stood in the winter sunlight streaming through the library windows and waited for Nathaniel to speak, to judge, to decide whether her broken trust could be worthy of his patient regard. Nathaniel remained silent for a long moment after Eleanor's confession ended, and she watched him with her heart suspended between beats as his grey eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to see not just her present fear, but all the accumulated pain that had shaped it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried a weight of emotion carefully controlled. And he began by telling her something she had not known, that he too had once been engaged, years ago before his diplomatic service, to a young woman of good family whom he had believed he loved with the fervent certainty of youth. And she had seemed to return his affection with equal measure until 3 weeks before their wedding, when he discovered quite by accident that she had been conducting an affair with his closest friend, that the two had been planning to elope, but his friend's family had threatened disinheritance, and so she had remained engaged to Nathaniel while maintaining her true attachment elsewhere. And he had confronted her only to hear her admit with casual cruelty that she had never loved him, but rather his title and fortune, that she found him too serious and cold, that marrying him would have been a sacrifice she was willing to make for security but not for love. And Nathaniel told Eleanor that he had ended the engagement immediately and thrown himself into diplomatic work abroad, using duty and distance as shields against further vulnerability. And for years he had attended social functions when required, but had maintained careful emotional detachment, had refused all matchmaking attempts, and had built walls as surely as Eleanor had built hers. And he explained that what had drawn him to her was not pity or convenience, but rather recognition he had seen in her quiet composure and careful distance, a reflection of his own protective armor, had sensed beneath her controlled demeanor the same loneliness he felt. And their conversations had revealed not just intellectual compatibility, but something deeper, a quality of authenticity that came from having survived betrayal and chosen to continue living despite it. And he told her that her strength astonished him, that appearing in society after such public humiliation required courage he deeply admired, that managing her father's estate with such competence while carrying private pain spoke to character far beyond what society's shallow judgments recognized. And then his voice dropped even lower as he said the words that would echo in Eleanor's memory forever after. "I am not Pemberton, Eleanor. I do not make promises I cannot keep, and I would rather remain unmarried all my days than prove myself unworthy of the trust you might grant me." And he told her that he understood her fear because he had felt it himself, that learning to hope again after betrayal was perhaps the most difficult thing a heart could attempt, and so he would not press her for an immediate answer or demand that she set aside years of protective caution simply because he asked it, but instead he proposed that they have a long engagement, months or even a year if she required it, with no public announcement, no societal pressure, simply time for her to observe his consistency, to test his promises against his actions, to become certain in her own mind and heart that he meant what he said, and if at any point she wished to end the engagement, she would be free to do so without consequence or recrimination. And Eleanor found that tears were sliding down her cheeks as he spoke, years of held emotion finally releasing, and she realized that she was crying not from fear now but from something more complex, relief that he understood, gratitude that he offered patience rather than pressure, and beneath it all the tentative, fragile, terrifying whisper of hope that perhaps this time, this man, might actually prove constant, might actually mean his promises, might actually be offering not a repetition of past betrayal, but the possibility of future joy. And she managed to nod, though she could not yet speak, accepting his offer of time, not saying yes, but crucially not saying no either. And Nathaniel reached across the space between them to gently take her hand, his touch warm and steady, and they sat together in the winter sunlight, streaming through the library windows, while Eleanor's tears fell, and the world seemed to hold its breath at the threshold of transformation. Spring arrived with the tentative grace of all new beginnings, bringing with it pale green leaves unfurling on bare branches and early crocuses pushing through softened earth, and Eleanor watched the world's renewal from the windows of Hartwick Manor with something that felt dangerously close to hope, though she examined this feeling carefully, as one might examine a beautiful but potentially fragile thing, uncertain whether it would shatter at rough handling or prove more resilient than fear predicted. And in the months following her acceptance of Nathaniel's offered time, she discovered that trust could indeed be rebuilt through the accumulation of small consistencies he called, when he said he would, arrived at the precise hour promised, and when unexpected business required him to cancel an engagement, he sent word immediately with genuine apology and a specific alternate proposal, never leaving her to wonder or wait in the anxious uncertainty that had once defined her experience of promises, and they maintained their agreement of privacy, making no public announcement of understanding between them, which granted Eleanor the freedom to observe without the weight of societal expectation or the fear of public humiliation, should she ultimately decide she could not proceed, and she found herself gradually allowing hope to take root, imagining tentatively what a future might look like with this steady, patient man who treated her intelligence with respect and her fear with understanding, though there came an afternoon in late April when panic seized her without warning, as they sat in Hartwick Manor's drawing-room discussing a book he had brought her, and suddenly she could not breathe, could not think past the overwhelming certainty that she was being foolish, that trusting again would inevitably lead to fresh devastation, and she stood abruptly with some stammered excuse, expecting anger or frustration at her irrational terror. But Nathaniel simply set down his teacup and regarded her with those steady grey eyes and said quietly, "Eleanor, I am not going anywhere. Take whatever time you need. I will be here when you are ready to continue our conversation, or if you would prefer, I can take my leave and return tomorrow. Whatever grants you peace." And his calm acceptance of her fear without judgment or pressure somehow steadied her more than any protestations of devotion could have done. And in early May they attended a village charity event together at St. Catherine's Chapel, and Eleanor felt her heart pound as they approached the building where she had once stood, abandoned. But Nathaniel walked beside her with solid presence, and as they entered the nave with its familiar stone arches and stained glass windows, she realized, with something like revelation, that the chapel was simply a building, that the past was simply memory, that these physical spaces held only the power and meaning she chose to grant them, and standing there with Nathaniel's arm steady beneath her hand, she understood that she was not the same terrified, abandoned girl of 4 years ago, but rather a woman who had survived devastating pain and learned that she possessed a strength she had never imagined. And perhaps more significantly, she recognized that Nathaniel was not Pemberton, that his consistent presence over these months of quiet courtship had demonstrated character that actions proved far more reliably than words ever could. And as they moved through the chapel, distributing baskets to families in need, Eleanor felt something shift fundamentally within her. A loosening of the fear that had gripped her heart for so long, a cautious but genuine belief that perhaps this time, this man, this possibility, might actually lead not to fresh heartbreak, but to the authentic partnership and joy she had once dreamed possible. Summer arrived in waves of warmth and abundance, transforming the gardens of Hartwick Manor into a riot of color and fragrance, and Eleanor stood at her bedroom window one evening in late June, watching roses bloom in the golden light of approaching sunset, their petals unfurling with the confident certainty of things that knew their season had arrived, and she felt something settle within her that had been unsettled for so very long, a quiet certainty that mirrored the rose's unhesitating bloom, a recognition that her season too had finally come, that the long winter of fear and the tentative spring of cautious hope had given way to something warmer and more sure, and she realized with sudden crystalline clarity that she was ready, that the fear which had gripped her heart for months had not disappeared entirely, but had transformed into something she could carry without being crushed by its weight, into courage rather than paralysis, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that she wanted to marry Nathaniel Ashford, wanted to build a life with this patient, steady man who had proven through accumulated small consistencies that his promises meant something and the realization brought not panic as it once would have, but rather a sense of rightness that felt like coming home after long exile. And so she left her room with purpose, moving through the familiar corridors of Hartwick Manor and out into the gardens where she knew she would find him, for he had developed the habit of walking among the roses in the evening when he called, and she found him there as expected, his tall figure outlined against the honeyed light. And when he turned at her approach, something in her expression must have communicated her intent, because his grey eyes sharpened with attention and careful hope, and Eleanor stopped before him with her heart beating strong and steady rather than frantic, and she said with a voice that did not tremble, "Nathaniel, I have an answer for you." And she watched his hands tighten slightly at his sides, the only outward sign of tension in his otherwise composed demeanor, and she continued, "Yes, I will marry you. I am certain now. I am ready." And for a moment he simply looked at her as though committing the moment to permanent memory, and then joy broke across his features like sunrise, carefully controlled, as all his emotions were, but unmistakably genuine. And he stepped forward to take her hands in his touch warm and solid and real, and he said quietly, "Eleanor, you have made me happier than I believed possible." And then he was drawing her closer, and she was rising on her toes to meet him, and their first real kiss was everything she had not let herself imagine, tender and promising and full of the future they would build together. And when they finally drew apart, she said something that clearly surprised him. "I want to marry at St. Catherine's Chapel." And she saw his momentary concern that she was forcing herself to face trauma, but she shook her head and explained, "I will not let that place remain a site of sorrow. I will transform it, reclaim it, make it mean something new." And Nathaniel's expression shifted to profound admiration, and he said, "You are the bravest person I have ever known." And they stood together in the summer garden as the light faded to rose and gold, planning a future that felt not like naive dreams, but like solid ground beneath their feet. Eleanor's decision to marry at St. Catherine's Chapel required explanation, for Nathaniel's initial response had been immediate concern that she was forcing herself to confront trauma before she was ready, that she was attempting to prove something to society or to herself through sheer force of will rather than genuine healing. But she took his hands in hers there in the summer garden and explained with quiet conviction that this was not about forcing anything, but rather about reclaiming what had been stolen from her, that she would not allow that beautiful old chapel with its stone arches and jeweled light to remain forever in her mind, as the site of her greatest humiliation, that she refused to grant Pemberton's abandonment the power to transform a sacred space into a place of permanent pain. And as she spoke, Nathaniel's expression shifted from concern to profound admiration, for he understood that this was not the decision of a woman running from her past, but rather one who had decided to face it directly and transform its meaning through the creation of new and better memories. And he said quietly that he would support whatever she decided, that they could marry anywhere or nowhere as long as they married, but that if she chose St. Catherine's he would stand beside her with pride and joy. And in the days that followed, they began to plan a ceremony that would be intimate rather than grand, including only those people who had truly supported Eleanor through her darkest time rather than the obligation invitations and social climbing guests who had witnessed her first intended wedding. And when Eleanor told her parents of her decision, her mother wept with a complicated mixture of joy at the engagement and emotional recognition of her daughter's courage, while her father embraced her with fierce pride and said that she had become a woman of greater strength than he had ever imagined possible. And her sister Catherine responded with such enthusiastic support that Eleanor found herself laughing at the torrent of wedding planning suggestions, though they kept the plans simple and personal rather than elaborate. And there came an afternoon in July when Eleanor drove alone to St. Catherine's Chapel, asking her driver to wait while she entered the quiet nave by herself. And she stood in the precise spot where she had stood 4 years earlier in her elaborate gown, with her heart full of naive hope, waiting for a man who would never come. And the memory rose sharp and painful as it always did in this space. But this time Eleanor did not flee from it, but rather let herself feel it fully, the humiliation, the grief, the shattering of dreams. And then she consciously chose to forgive herself for having hoped that first time, for having been young enough and trusting enough to believe in promises that proved empty, and she allowed herself to acknowledge that hoping again with Nathaniel was not foolishness, but rather the profound courage of someone who had been devastated and yet refused to let devastation define the remainder of her life. And she stood there in the colored light, falling through stained glass windows, and made a promise to herself that when she returned to this chapel as a bride, she would not be the same frightened girl who had waited here in vain, but rather a woman who knew her own worth and had chosen a man who recognized and honored that worth consistently through action rather than empty words. Autumn had returned to the countryside with its particular slant of golden light and crisp promise of transformation, and on a morning in late September, 4 years almost to the day since that grey dawn, when Eleanor had waited at an altar for a man who never came, she stood once more in her bedroom at Hartwick Manor, preparing to become a bride. But everything about this preparation felt fundamentally different from that first fevered anticipation, for where once there had been frantic hope and nervous excitement, now there existed a deep, calm certainty that settled in her bones like bedrock. And her gown reflected this transformation, being simpler in design than the elaborate confection she had worn before, made of ivory silk that fell in clean, elegant lines without excessive ornamentation, as though the dress itself understood that she no longer needed artifice or decoration, but could stand in her own essential truth. And as her mother fastened the small pearl buttons at her back, Eleanor noticed that her hands were steady rather than trembling, her breathing even rather than quick with panic, and she met her own eyes in the mirror and recognized the woman looking back at her, not the naive girl who had believed promises came without proof, but a woman who had been broken and had painstakingly reassembled herself into something stronger and more authentic than she had been before. And when her father came to collect her, his eyes filled with tears as he said she had never looked more beautiful, though Eleanor knew he meant not her appearance, but rather the quality of peace that emanated from her, the visible evidence of hard-won healing. And as they drove through familiar countryside toward Street, Catherine's chapel, she noted, landmarks that had not changed in 4 years, while she had changed entirely, the ancient oak at the crossroads still spreading its branches in benediction, and the stone bridge over the stream, still arching gracefully over water that flowed always forward, never back. And when the chapel came into view, her heart beat strong and steady rather than frantic, and the autumn morning had blessed them with weather that seemed like grace made manifest, warm light pouring through gaps in white clouds to gild the ancient stones. And her father helped her from the carriage with a hand that trembled slightly, though hers did not, and together they entered the chapel's small vestibule, where Catherine waited with Eleanor's simple bouquet of roses and Michaelmas daisies, her sister's face radiant with joy and fierce pride. And then the chapel doors opened, and Eleanor could see down the short aisle to where Nathaniel stood, waiting beside the altar. His tall figure, solid and present and utterly certain, his grey eyes finding hers immediately with an expression of such profound love and steady commitment that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, though they were tears of gratitude rather than fear, and as she walked forward on her father's arm, she was acutely aware of the profound difference between this moment and that terrible morning 4 years ago. For then she had walked toward empty space and broken promises, while now she walked toward a man who had proven through countless small consistencies that his word meant something, that his presence could be relied upon, and that he would not vanish like morning mist when tested. And when her father placed her hand in Nathaniel's, the warmth and solidity of his grasp felt like an answer to questions she had been asking for years, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was finally, truly chosen. The ceremony began with such quiet simplicity that it felt almost like a prayer rather than a public declaration, and as Eleanor stood beside Nathaniel before the vicar, she was acutely aware of the faces gathered in the pews behind them, not the crowd of obligation and curiosity that had witnessed her first intended wedding, but rather the small collection of people who had truly loved her through her darkest time, her parents with tears already streaming down their faces, her sister Catherine beaming with fierce joy, Nathaniel's closest friend, Lord Ashworth, who had become her friend as well, the housekeeper from Hartwick Manor, who had brought Eleanor tea during those first terrible weeks of isolation, the tenant families who had benefited from her careful management and had never treated her as an object of pity. And as the vicar began the traditional words, Eleanor found that her voice emerged steady and clear when it came time to speak her vows. No trembling or hesitation, but rather a firm certainty that seemed to come from some deep place within her that had been forged through suffering into something unshakable. and she promised to love and honor this man, not with the naive enthusiasm of untested hope, but with the conscious choice of someone who understood exactly what promises meant and how much courage it required to make them. And when Nathaniel spoke his vows in return, his grey eyes never left hers, and his words were not the standard formal phrases, but rather something he had written himself, specific and personal, referencing the garden where they had first truly talked, the patience they had both learned through their separate wounds, the partnership of equals he envisioned for their future, and his voice held such quiet intensity that Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks though she was smiling. And when the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, and Nathaniel kissed her with tender reverence, Eleanor experienced an emotional breakthrough so profound it felt almost physical, as though something that had been frozen inside her chest for 4 years suddenly thawed and began to flow again. And it was not simple joy she felt, though joy was certainly present, but rather something more complex and hard-won vindication that she had been right to hope again. Healing that came from having a terrible memory overlaid with a beautiful one in the same space. Transformation from the abandoned girl she had been into the chosen woman she had become. And as they turned to walk back down the aisle together, Eleanor was overwhelmingly conscious of the symbolic completion of this moment, and that she was walking the same path she had walked alone in devastation 4 years ago, but now walking it with a partner whose hand held hers firmly, and whose presence beside her was solid proof that some stories did find their proper endings, even after the most painful false starts. And when they emerged from the chapel into autumn sunlight that had broken through the morning clouds, with almost theatrical timing, Eleanor paused and turned to look back at the ancient stone building, and she consciously released the ghost of that grey morning when she had stood inside alone and humiliated. Let it dissipate like smoke into the golden air, and she understood that Catherine's chapel would never again hold power over her as a site of trauma, but had been reclaimed as simply a beautiful old building where she had once suffered but had ultimately triumphed. And Nathaniel squeezed her hand gently, as though he understood exactly what this moment meant to her. And together they walked toward the carriage that would carry them forward into their future, leaving the past finally and fully behind them where it belonged. 5 years had passed since that autumn morning, when Eleanor had walked down the aisle of Catherine's chapel as the Duchess of Thornwick, and the transformation of her life had been so complete and so profound that sometimes she had to pause and remind herself that the anxious, guarded woman she had been was the same person as the woman she had become. And on a warm afternoon in late summer, she stood in the gardens of Thornwick Estate, watching her children play among the rose beds that she herself had redesigned. 3-year-old James chasing butterflies with the serious concentration he had inherited from his father, while baby Caroline dozed in her nurse's arms in the dappled shade of an ancient oak, and Eleanor felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful in its intensity, not the shallow happiness of someone who had never suffered, but rather the hard-won peace of someone who had descended into darkness and climbed back into light and knew the difference between the two, and she had grown into her role as Duchess with a confidence that came from genuine partnership with Nathaniel, for he consulted her on estate matters and political decisions, and treated her not as an ornament or a vessel for heirs, but as an equal whose intelligence and judgment he valued, and the household staff respected her because she had earned that respect through competence and fairness, and the tenants trusted her because she knew their names and their concerns and worked tirelessly to improve their conditions. And when society whispered about the Duchess of Thornwick, now they spoke not of the woman who had been abandoned, but rather of her remarkable management of the estate during Nathaniel's absence on diplomatic missions, her clever solutions to agricultural problems, her kindness to those in need. And that afternoon, as Eleanor stood in her garden, a carriage arrived bearing a young woman she had met briefly in London, Lady Beatrice Weston, whose face bore the particular pallor and brittle composure that Eleanor recognized immediately as the mask of recent social devastation, for Beatrice's engagement had been broken under scandalous circumstances, and she had come to Thornwick at Eleanor's gentle invitation to escape the worst of London's gossip, and Eleanor received her with warmth and without questions, understanding that what the girl needed most was simple acceptance without judgment, and over tea in the drawing room. Beatrice's composure finally cracked, and she spoke haltingly of her humiliation and her fear that she would never recover, that her life was effectively over at 22, and Eleanor listened with the patience of someone who had walked this path herself, and when Beatrice finally fell silent, Eleanor spoke quietly of her own experience, not in dramatic detail but with simple honesty, and she told the younger woman that the pain she felt was real and valid, and should not be diminished, but that it would not last forever. That healing was possible even when it seemed impossible, that sometimes what felt like the worst thing that could happen was actually a redirection towards something better, and Beatrice looked at her with dawning hope, as though Eleanor's very existence was proof that survival was possible. And later that evening, when the children had been put to bed, Eleanor and Nathaniel sat together in the library, in the comfortable silence of two people who did not need constant conversation to feel connected, and he looked up from the correspondence he was reading to study her face, with an expression of such enduring love that Eleanor felt her heart expand, as it still did after 5 years of marriage, and he said simply that watching her counsel Beatrice had reminded him of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place, her strength and compassion, and refusal to let suffering make her bitter, and Eleanor crossed to him and took his hand and reflected aloud that she was grateful for all of it, even the pain, because that terrible day at Street, Catherine's chapel had set her on a path that led eventually to this room, this man, this life, and she understood now that sometimes the worst heartbreak was necessary to break open the places where real love could eventually take root.